through the book of Numbers. Tim has gone down to make a few more copies of the outline. So when he comes back up, if you need one, you can raise your hand and he'll get you a copy of it. I hope that you are enjoying this. I am probably getting more out of it than you are. I'm learning quite a bit as I'm going through. I was thinking the other night as I was working on this, I have never really sat down and went through book by book the way I'm doing for these outlines. And when you do that, you see a lot of things that I think help us to more fully understand how God brought Christ to be our Savior, and why things in the New Testament are the way that they are. And I think to better understand the New Testament, if we better understand the Old Testament, it helps us in our understanding. Okay, we will look at the book of Numbers tonight. Numbers takes off where Leviticus left off. When the book of Leviticus closes, the children of Israel are at Mount Sinai. And when the book of Numbers opens or begins, the children of Israel are still at Mount Sinai. The children of Israel were at Mount Sinai for about a year, and that included the time of the giving of the law and then the times that they spent there waiting to get ready to move. Numbers goes through, it covers 40-ish years, give or take. It covers the wandering of the children of Israel, and they wandered for 40 years. And when the book of Numbers closes, the children of Israel are on the east side of the Jordan River and are beginning to make preparations to go into the Promised Land. So that's kind of the time frame that it covers. When we begin reading in the book of the book of Numbers, we see that it gets its name from a couple of the censuses that were taken that God instructed Moses to take. And that, of course, the first census was taken there at Mount Sinai. Then the last census was taken just prior to them going into the Promised Land. The numbers remained of the children of Israel remained relatively the same. In the first census that was taken, now keep in mind that what Moses was told to count were those 20 years old and older that were able to go to war. So that left out quite a few folks. And that number was 603,550. And so if you take into consideration the number of children under the age of 20, those and the women folk, and then those that were not able to go to war, maybe because they were older, past the age, just not physically able to go, then the numbers of the children of Israel could very well double that number. Could very easily be well over 1 million folks. And so we see, and of course, Moses is instructed to count the children of Israel around, and then he was also told not to count the Levites in that census. But the Levites were counted in their own counting. And of the Levites, there were from 1 month old and above. And there were 22,000 of them. And this was the male children, from 1 month old and above. And then over in chapter 4, there is another counting of the Levites that were from the age 30 males from the age 30 up to 50 years old, those that might be serving as, or in the temple as priests, and that number was about 2,750. So that kind of tells you about how many people there were, how many men there were that served in the temple as priests. And you think, well, that's a lot of men for their responsibility to be to take care of the tabernacle. But not only were they to take care of that tabernacle, when they got ready to move from Sinai and begin their wandering, these priests were responsible to take down the tabernacle, to take the furnishings and move them. And certain priests, certain families of priests, were instructed on certain things that they were to take care of. It wasn't just a haphazard thing, everybody go in and start taking things down, but God gave instructions. He also gave instructions on how they were to camp, who was to camp where, around the tabernacle. And you see on your outline, we have them there that remember, the tabernacle always, the entrance of the tabernacle always faced the east. And notice that on those that camped on the east side of the tabernacle, well, keep in mind you have the tabernacle, and then surrounding the tabernacle, you have the Levites that are camping all around the tabernacle. Then on the east side, you have Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. They camp, that group camps on the east side. And this is also their marching order. In other words, when they got ready to leave, they just didn't everybody bunch up. There was a certain order in which they were to march. And you have on your list there, before those that were camped to the east, you have Moses, Aaron, and his sons, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And they always led the way. So, of course, Moses would have been camped around with the Levites, but when they got ready to march, they would take Aaron and his sons would carry the ark. Then you had those that were camped to the east, which was Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and they were first. And also Judah was always first. And you remember that Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. Now, I don't know if that was the reason that Judah was first or not, but that was the way it laid out. And then following the Judah, those that were on the east, then there was another group of Levites, two families of Levites, and they carried the tabernacle, the tent. And they were responsible for taking that. Then those that were camped to the south were Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. And then following them, the Levites that carried the furnishings and the altar was the Cohenites. And then those that were camped on the west side, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then on the north side, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And that kind of gets through the first 4 chapters. Then as you go on and you look from chapters 5 to 10, we're going to take a pretty good jump right here. But in chapters 5 through 10, you get a lot of laws regarding purity and how to keep everyone pure and how to keep everyone where they needed to be. And I want you to think about that, because where did God dwell? God dwelt in the tabernacle. And so the priests were around the tabernacle, and then the people were around that. So if God was in their midst, then they needed to make every effort to make sure that they were pure, that they were holy. Now, don't you and I need to do the same thing? If God dwells in us, because remember, our bodies is a temple of God. So should we not go to put every effort into being pure, to being holy? Peter writes that, speaking through as God would say, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." So we need to be holy, and that's one of the things here, that the priests were to keep the congregation pure. And as you go through chapters 5 and 10, it's laws on purity, and laws concerning an unfaithful wife, how to find out the truth if it's not forthcoming, and you can read about that on your own. Laws of restitution, the second Passover, in case someone was unclean when the Passover came, then there would be another Passover after they became clean, so that they could partake of the Passover and wouldn't have to wait another year. And so you can read about that in chapter 9. Talks about the 2 silver trumpets, and we read there that how certain sounds gave you certain instructions. Now you think about having, let's just say, 1 million people around this church building. That's similar to what Israel had. And so they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have, all this. They communicated by sending messages, by blowing the trumpets. And so God was using all of that to provide for them ways to communicate. Now, in chapters 10, Israel, the trumpet is blown. The pillar of cloud that was over the tabernacle came up and began to move, and that was a sign for the children of Israel to begin to move. Now, I want you to think something here right quick. If the cloud was way over there and going in that direction, and then David was going in this direction, what would I be doing? I would be separating myself from God. And you think, well, how easy would that have been to be able to look and see that cloud, and then all I know I've got to do is follow that cloud to be with God. Our cloud today is God's Word. And if we follow the cloud of God's Word, then we will be with God. We will be walking with God. Now, the cloud began to move, and the people began to move, and then shortly thereafter, they began to complain. Shauna told me before services, she read through part of the book of Numbers and said she learned one thing: not to complain. Because it doesn't work out very well. And as we go through their journey from Sinai to the east of the Jordan River, it seems like it goes downhill. It seems like they don't learn from their mistakes. But they begin to move. They go up through the wilderness of Zin, and they begin to complain. They say, hey, there was plenty of food in Egypt. Now you brought us out here to starve to death. God provides them with manna. Well, that's really not good enough. They get tired of manna, and they say, all we've had is this manna, and, we're ready for something else. Well, God, we talked Wednesday night about anger and how that, in this point, God got angry with the children of Israel. And God was going to say, okay, I'm going to wipe them out, and I'll bring up another nation and make you a great nation. But here, Moses intercedes for the people. And so God provides for them quail. And so they were able to have quail to eat, and they were able, so that calmed them down for a little while. But it seems like that they were never satisfied. And then to me, when you get into chapter 12, you see something that happens in chapter 12 that you think, why in the world? But Aaron and Miriam rise up against Moses. His own brother and sister think, well, God has talked to us and through us. Who do you think you are, Moses? And God calls them out. And I want you to think about what happens in this passage. God was angry with them, and God calls Miriam and Aaron and tells, you come to the entrance of the temple or the tabernacle. Now you think about getting called out by God and saying, I want to talk to you. And knowing that God was not pleased. And I want to read what God said to them. It's starts in chapter 12, begins in verse 6. Then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees from the form of the Lord. Why then were you afraid to speak against Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And in verse 9 says, so the anger of the Lord was aroused against him, and he departed. And when the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous. Miriam, because of this, was given leprosy. She didn't die, but yet the camp remained still as long as she was leprosy and until she went through the laws of purification. But God put Aaron and Miriam in their place because Moses was selected by God. Then as they continue their travel, they get to Kadesh, which is at the southern end of the Promised Land. And here we read about the spies that were sent in. And again, this is one of the downfalls that happens with the children of Israel. You remember that Moses sent in 12 spies by the instruction of God, one from each tribe. They go in, they scout out the land, they come back and say, well, 10 of them say we can't take it. Truly it is a land that flows with milk and honey. They carried one of the stalks or clusters of grapes back between two poles, or between a pole that they were carrying it on, to show how, and then that they felt like grasshoppers in front of those that lived in Canaan. And those 10 said, we cannot take this land. Joshua and Caleb said we can, because God is with us. And the people those 10 began to stir up all the other people. And so the children of Israel then refused to go into the land of Canaan. They even come to the point of rebelling to the point that they were going to select a new leader to take them back to Egypt. And we know what happens to those 10 spies that said we can't take it. They lost their life in a plague. God caused those 10 men to die. We also know that the children of Israel, because of their not going on into the land of Canaan like God had instructed, God again was going to destroy them. But Moses goes to bat for them again. And he says, okay, then you're going to be wandering for 4 generations or for 40 years until all of those who and above the age of 20, your carcasses are going to fall in the desert. In other words, you're going to die. You're going to be wandering for 40 years and you're going to die in the desert. And except for Joshua and Caleb. Incidentally, Caleb is of the tribe of Judah, and Joshua is of the tribe of Ephraim. Then as we go on and look at things, we talked about God was going to destroy the Israelites with the pestilence, but Moses again there intercedes. Then as we go on through, they begin their wanderings in the wilderness. In chapter 14 also we read about the people decide, okay, we're going to invade, we're going to fight the Amalekites and the Canaanites. And Moses saying, hey, this is not going to work. But yet they decide on their own that that's what they're going to do. And it doesn't work. And that attempt fails. Then as you go on through and look at some other passages in chapters 14 and 15, again there are some other guidelines or laws for them to live by. One that stuck out in my mind was the one that was found for gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And he was found gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And you remember God said you can work 6 days, but on the Sabbath day you rest. And the law was that this man was to be stoned. And to be stoned by the congregation. So that they could witness that and see that. And that would have been his punishment. Now, we've not only had the rebellion of the people, the rebellion of Moses or Miriam and Aaron, but in chapter 16 we have the rebellion of Korah and about 250 other men and these folks are priests. And again, there seems to be that jealousy there between those priests, and they think Moses is putting himself up where he shouldn't be. And when Moses hears all this, he falls on his face and he pleads with them and he says, okay, here's what we do. Everybody, take your censer and put fire in it and let God choose whom he wants to be the leader. And of course, God chooses Moses. And God said here, I will consume those who were rebelling. And that day, those men lost their lives because the ground opened up and swallowed them. God was going to just strike them dead. But Moses says, that's something that happens all the time. And so God had the earth open up and swallow those men. You would think that by this time, they would have learned all the things that they had seen. And, many of these folks, had come out of Egypt and had saw the plagues and witnessed those plagues and then seen the parting of the Red Sea and all the things that God did for the children of Israel. But yet they were still rebellious all the way through and didn't want to be obedient. We've mentioned it several times that people say, well, if God would just show himself, if God would just perform a miracle from heaven where everybody would know who he was, know he was there, see him, then everybody would follow God. Well, go back and look in your Old Testament. They didn't. They saw all of these miracles and still they didn't obey. Then as we get on down into verse 17, again there seems to be some confusion about who is to be high priest or the selection of the high priest. and God instructs Moses to tell them to each one take their rod and put it in the tabernacle, and whichever one blooms or buds, that's who I have selected. And we hear about Aaron's rod that budded. And so that was the selection of Aaron. And then shortly following that in chapter 20, we read about, in chapter 20, again, the children of Israel are complaining. They are thirsty again. And God instructs Moses to go to the rock and to speak to the rock. And what does Moses do? Instead of doing what God says, remember the first time in Exodus chapter 17, God told him to strike the rock. And he did, and water came forth. But this time, he strikes the rock twice when God says, speak to the rock. Moses speaks, but he doesn't speak to the rock. He speaks to the people. And he says, you rebels, and notice what he says, and I think it's important what he says. You rebels, must we bring water from this rock? Must we bring water? Him and Aaron. You see, there, and God says, because of this, because you've not believed me, because you've not hallowed me before the people, then you will not enter into the promised land. And then as we see that, we know that Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. In chapter 20, we read about Aaron dies. And if you think about the way that Aaron, what happens to Aaron, Moses is to take him up on the mountain. He is to take his priestly garments off of him and put his garments on Eleazar, which is Aaron's son. And then Aaron dies. Then, I think I skipped over where Miriam dies. But Miriam also dies at Kadesh, but it wasn't from the leprosy. But Aaron and Miriam have both at this point died, and then they go from again there in Kadesh. They're complaining and they're murmuring, and here's where God sends the fiery serpents in chapters 20 through 21. And Moses is instructed to, once these serpents are biting the children of Israel and they're dying, God instructs Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and those that looked on that would be saved. Now, this is a pattern of Jesus, because when they looked at that, then they were saved. They were healed. And Jesus mentions that himself in John chapter 3. It says, as Moses raised up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be raised up. And so that is a pattern of Jesus being raised up in the wilderness. Because if Jesus is raised up on the cross, we look to the cross, and if we are obedient to the cross and to Jesus, then we will be saved. So those that looked at the cross, looked at the fiery serpent, were healed. And notice one thing, keep in mind, that just knowing about that bronze serpent on that pole, just knowing about it wasn't enough. They had to go and look at it. And why in the world, if you had got bitten by one of those serpents and you were dying, why wouldn't you get up and go and look on that serpent? And if we liken that to our obedience unto God, why in the world, if we know that we're dying in sin, why in the world would we not go look to Jesus and do what Jesus told us to do, which was in order to be He told his disciples to go ye into all the world, preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. So why would we not do that when we're dying in sin? And Jesus says there is no other way. That's it. That's the only way. And that was the only way for them to be saved from the bite of that serpent. Okay, when we get into chapters 22 through 32, they are kindly preparing to go into the promised land. They have fought a couple of battles and won. They had defeated King Sihon and King Og. But then King Balaam, or Balak, sees this, and so he sends for Balaam to come and to curse the children of Israel because he's afraid of them. And you remember, we know Balaam because, remember, his donkey talked to him. And Balaam was going to go curse the children of Israel, but God appeared to him and said, don't do it, don't go with them. And so when it all boils down to the fact that all Balaam can do is bless the children of Israel. And you remember the story, as they were going through, the angel stood in front, the donkey pressed his leg up against the wall, and he got off and began to beat the donkey, and then because the donkey saw the angel, and Balaam didn't. And then the donkey began to speak to him. Said, hey, I've carried you all these places you went. Why are you beating me? And I think about that for a minute. What that must have been like. And then, and Balaam does not curse the children of Israel, but blesses the children of Israel. I had another thought that run through my mind. It didn't stop. It ain't coming back. Maybe it will. Okay, as we get on into chapter 25, we see where the children of Israel began to go off with what is considered foreigners, those outside the children of Israel. They began to worship their gods. And, that's one of the things that God had told them, to stay within the children of Israel. Don't marry outside the Israelite nation. But many of them did. And he said, the reason I don't want you to is because they will draw you away to worship other gods. And many of them did marry those outside the Jewish nation. And we read there in chapter 25 where there were 24,000 that were killed with the plague because of their disobedience. Think about if God dealt with us today the same way He dealt with them then. How many of us would be left? That's what Shauna said. I don't need to be complaining. If God, dealt with us today the same way He dealt with them, then where would we be? Then as we get on toward the end, there's another census taken, the second census that is taken. And the numbers there of the children of Israel, of the 12 tribes, are 601,730. Less than there was before. Instead of using that, remember all the other time in Egypt, what happened? They multiplied. That was one of the reasons that they were put into slavery by the Pharaoh of Egypt. Because they multiplied, and no matter what they did, they couldn't stop them from multiplying. But now their numbers actually went down. And the Levites had 1,000 more. They were 23,000. But they didn't use that time because they were not following God to multiply and to grow stronger. And remember, that 601,000, those were the ones that could go to war, 20 years old and older, that could go to war. Then as we get into chapter 27, we read about Moses he realizes and he knows that he's not going to be able to go into the promised land. God has already told him that. And he begins to prepare Joshua to be the next leader. As we get into Deuteronomy, we'll see where Moses spends more time preparing them and giving them instructions and speeches, I guess, so to speak, telling them, okay, here's the way things are going to be. But he's beginning to prepare them. And then as you go on through toward the end of the chapter, we read about additional laws and when they're there on the east side of the Jordan River. And then there are some other laws that are given. And some, Reuben and Gad, decide to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. And then toward the last, chapter 33 kind of rehearses or goes back over their journey from Sinai. And, talks about them going from Sinai through the wilderness of Zin, and then to the boundaries of Canaan, and it's from the wilderness of Zin, and the east is the boundary is the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. To the west it would be the Mediterranean Sea, and then up north it's a few areas up there, Zedad and Ziphron and Hazar Enan, I guess is how you say that. I don't know if I pronounced them right or not. But those were the boundaries of the promised land. And then also began to make preparations for the division of the promised land. That's a quick run through of the 36 verses or chapters in the book of Numbers. There are things that you and I can take from that just reinforce the fact that we need to be faithful to God. Because some people say, well, God is love and God won't punish people for eternity. God will punish people for eternity because He said He would. And if we say otherwise, then we are calling God a liar. It's that plain and it's that simple. And the Bible tells us that God is not human, that He can lie. But God cannot lie, and God will not lie. When God says, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to punish you. And if you don't believe it, look at what He done to the children of Israel. Those thousands of people that were going to the promised land died in the wilderness because they were not obedient. The same, we can liken that to our life here on this earth. If we're not obedient to God, we're going to die in the wilderness and not have a home in heaven with God. This is our wandering time right now. And whether or not we go on to the promised land or not is up to us. If you want to go to the promised land, you have to do exactly what Jesus told His disciples to do, and what Jesus did, to be baptized for the remission of your sins, and then continue to live faithful. If you've done that, but have not lived faithful, God is standing ready and willing for you to come back, and He'll forgive you if you'll just ask. If we can assist you in any way, we encourage you to come.